Welcome, everyone. So this week's reading touches upon a broad array of pretty weighty issues relating to California's history. It references regional historical differences, for instance, how San Francisco, the Central Valley, and Los Angeles all developed along very different lines, shaped by people who had different visions of how to establish the good life in a new place. In this module and next week's module, we examine different aspects of California's diversity and political philosophies that have shaped the state. One aspect of diversity highlighted in your reading this week is immigration and the different views about current immigration policy. In this video, I want to situate our understanding of the current immigration debate by examining California's really fraught history relating to immigration and race relations. While today we celebrate the value of a diverse state and recognize the contributions of people from all walks of life and all corners of the globe to California's cultural and economic vibrancy, it's important to also understand the ways in which political life in this state have always involved tension and conflict over who should be recognized as belonging to California's political community. All right, let's talk a little state history. So a detailed history of the state is beyond the scope of this class, but I do want to briefly highlight how the land that we know as California today has been claimed by many different peoples over time. Hopefully the basics of this history will be familiar to you already. And actually, I'd be really interested to learn from your discussion board posts how much of California's history you already know and learned in high school. So the first European power to claim California as its territory was Spain in the year 1542. And of course, the Spanish did not find an unpopulated land. It's estimated there were nearly 300,000 people belonging to over 100 Native American tribes who had arrived thousands of years before the Spanish. Spain's grip on California was relatively light for quite some time, as California was kind of seen as something of a new world backwater by the colonial powers of the time. But in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Spanish colonization of California really began in earnest. This had a devastating effect on the native peoples of the area, as their communities were almost entirely decimated. In 1821, Mexico gained independence from Spain, with California included as part of Mexican territory at that time. So as you can see from the map on this slide, Mexican territory extended far north to include modern-day New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, and Nevada, as well as California in the early part of the 19th century. But this territory became part of the United States as a result of the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. And just as that war was coming to a close, the gold rush brought a huge influx of new settlers to California. This rapid population growth, combined with the complicated politics at that time over the balance between free states and slave states in the Union, put California on a fast track towards statehood. So in 1850, just 2 years after becoming U.S. territory, and only a year after the gold rush, California gained statehood. California's admission to the Union was part of a sweeping package known as the Compromise of 1850 that hammered out some thorny points of conflict between slave states and free states. While this compromise was seen as forestalling the Civil War, it was a balancing act that would only hold for a few years before completely unraveling. When it was admitted to the Union, California was the first non-contiguous state, meaning it wasn't geographically connected to any other state. The map on this slide shows the presidential election results from 1856, a pretty stark depiction of how geographically separated California was from the rest of the country. This is just another way of understanding the point made in your book chapter about California's diversity arising from different groups of people willing to chase dreams of a better life far from their original homes. Whether it was Anglo settlers from the East Coast viewing California as Land's End, Asian immigrants who viewed it as a new shore from across the Pacific, or Mexican settlers who viewed California as El Norte, the people who came to California during this time shared an adventurer spirit. As California exploded in population in the early years of statehood, Conflicts between different groups, between new settlers and established communities, became intense. The Spanish-speaking people who had lived in California under Mexican rule, known as Californios, faced discrimination from the growing predominant Anglo population. Much of their land, in the form of ranchos like the one pictured on this slide, was seized by the state. Some of this land was then handed over to the railroad companies. California was in a big hurry to achieve new levels of prosperity promised by the commercial opportunities that would be opened up by the Transcontinental Railroad. And in the rush to complete that project, loose government policies made some railroad owners stunningly rich. California's major railroad owners, known as the Big Four, received huge grants of land from the state and became some of the wealthiest men in California. Pictured third from the left in the series of portraits on this slide is one of the Big Four you might have heard of, Leland Stanford, who used part of his railroad fortune to found Stanford University. The booming economics of mining and railroads created amazing wealth in the state, but also created levels of economic inequality that were quite different than what had existed before. And California's titans of business used their wealth to gain influence in state government to receive favorable treatment. These were some early seeds that would lead to a growing sense that government under the California Constitution of 1849 had become corrupt and that a new government framework had to be established to give more power to the people. In the boom times of the 1800s, many Chinese immigrants came to California looking for work, particularly in the mines and the railroads. Almost from the start, the Chinese population in California faced intense discrimination. For example, Chinese miners faced licensing taxes targeted specifically against them. Chinese nationals were forbidden from testifying against whites in court. Chinese laundries were shut down by government regulation, and Chinatowns were attacked by arsonists. In the years immediately following the Civil War, the United States ratified 3 new amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The primary purpose of these so-called Reconstruction Amendments was to extend full citizenship rights to former slaves in the South. The 14th Amendment, for example, guarantees birthright citizenship as well as due process and equal treatment under the law for all people. You might expect that when this amendment was adopted in 1868, just a few years after the Civil War, in which California was on the side of the Union, that California would have been in support of this measure. However, politicians in California voted against ratification of the 14th Amendment because they realized it would restrict their ability to pass laws targeted against the Chinese population in California. Although the 14th Amendment gained support from enough states to go into force in 1868, it actually wasn't until the 1950s that California officially changed its stance and changed its vote in favor of the 14th Amendment. While California politicians lost the fight against the 14th Amendment, they were nevertheless successful at mobilizing anti-Chinese sentiment and enacting it into law. So, for example, when California redrafted its state constitution in 1879, it included provisions forbidding businesses from hiring Chinese workers and allowing municipalities to remove Chinese residents from city limits. These provisions were later struck down as a violation of the 14th Amendment, but they highlight the fact that anti-Chinese sentiment was so strong at the time that racial discrimination was actually written into the state's basic document outlining its principles of government. While those constitutional provisions were struck down, California politicians in Washington, D.C. were successful at getting Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This act essentially barred any new arrivals from China into the United States and contained provisions to encourage the Chinese nationals already living in the U.S. to return to their native country. The U.S.'s first immigration law targeted at restricting entry to a particular race of people came about as a result of the racial turmoil that was brewing in California at the time. As with California's Chinese population, people of Mexican descent have faced discriminatory government policies in the state, especially during difficult economic times. One lesser-known example of this is an expulsion program put together by the city of Los Angeles, as well as the local Chamber of Commerce and other local governments during the Great Depression in the 1930s. With unemployment skyrocketing and competition for jobs becoming intense, city leaders in LA determined that driving out Mexican Americans would be an effective way of protecting jobs held by whites. In no uncertain terms, the Mexican American population was told they were no longer welcome in the area and would not be hired by any businesses. They were loaded onto trains by the tens of thousands and sent to Mexico. It made little difference if they had left Mexico many years earlier, or if they were American citizens born in the United States to immigrant parents. This dark moment in the state's history received very little scrutiny until the early 2000s, when people who had suffered as a result of this deportation program joined together to file a class action lawsuit. Representatives in the California legislature held hearings on the matter to bring the details of the policy to public light. As a result, in 2005, the California state legislature passed a formal resolution apologizing for the treatment of people of Mexican descent who were forced from their homes. Okay, so this video has raised a couple examples of racial and anti-immigration discrimination in the state's early history. We could also look to more recent examples, including the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, the treatment of African Americans who moved especially to the Los Angeles area during the post-war economic boom, or the reaction against Latino farm workers in the Central Valley who organized for better working conditions. So why highlight these dark moments of racial tension in California's political history? Things are better now, right? Well, certainly in terms of how Californians view race and immigration, attitudes have definitely changed. For example, the chart on this slide shows the dramatic increase in favorable perceptions of immigration among Californians over the last 2 decades. But it's important to know our history because it informs how we understand the present. I am teaching, and you are taking a class at an educational institution that explicitly embraces diversity as a strength of our society. That emphasis on valuing diversity is a relatively new phenomenon, and it's not without controversy even today. Issues of identity, belonging, citizenship, basically who we are as a people and who has a right to be here, these ideas are still fiercely contested. At the moment, the federal government has taken a much harder line approach on immigration than we've seen in previous recent years, with a particular emphasis on removing undocumented immigrants from the country. Now, reasonable people can disagree about the best way to design and enforce the country's immigration laws. But what's particularly concerning about this moment in time is that the rhetoric coming from President Trump around immigration strongly echoes these dark chapters in our earlier history. I've asked you to read the Atlantic article, Where Does Trump's Invasion Rhetoric Come From?, because it succinctly establishes a clear connection between the anti-Chinese sentiment of late 1800s California with President Trump's current anti-immigrant rhetoric. When a president uses words like invasion or infestation, it has real-world consequences in justifying playing fast and loose with the rules. For instance, the Time article I've asked you to read, Citizens Facing Deportation Isn't New, documents that just as American citizens were deported as a result of LA's discriminatory program in the 1930s, today's emphasis on aggressive immigration enforcement has resulted in the detainment and sometimes even the deportation of American citizens. Your book chapter this week raises a large and important question. And to quote from your chapter, how can a California full of strangers, full of people who by occupation and prejudice oppose and may even oppress one another's interests, become a people of a single citizenship? So to that, I would say that it's the ultimate challenge and promise of California, of thriving as a multi-ethnic and multiracial state with a diverse economy and geography, where we overcome the oppressions of the past. So my implicit argument in posting this video is that we can only forge what the authors call that single citizenship, or a common Californian identity, by understanding and coming to grips with our history. So that's my take on this. Now I want to hear your voice. So what are your reflections on this video and your readings this week? How important do you think it is to address our history and explicitly examine race and ethnicity in order to move forward as a state? How well do you think we do overall as a state in binding ourselves together as Californians, regardless of our individual backgrounds?